Good evening. My name is Dan Swistel. I'm very proud president of the Ukrainian Institute of America. And on behalf of myself and our entire board and membership, we are overwhelmed to invite you to our facility this evening. So happy that you could all come on this cold night and see this building and hear this wonderful lecture about the building that could have been across the street. Mostly besides saying hello, I just wanted to, beyond welcoming you, during the reception on the third floor, I wanted to make sure you all felt free to wander up to the fourth floor. We have temporarily installed an exhibit on the landmark status of this building, and so there will be a reception for the Landmark Commission here sometime in April, and we volunteered to make an exhibit about the history of this building and the history of this block on the Upper East Side. The landmark exhibit will eventually be installed in our ground floor room and should be open for several months. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Benjamin Kalash, our governmental agent, city council member. Benjamin.
I'm Councilmember Ben Kalis. I represent the Upper East Side with Councilmember Dan Gorodnik. We're actually in Dan's district, but the Ukrainian Institute is actually a place that I hold in high regard. My wife was born in Ukraine, so we've been here before. Can I just see a show of hands how many people have been here before? That is great, so please make sure to take it in, and if I can just get a pledge from everybody in this room that you'll be back again to see one of their great cultural pieces. In addition to the East Side, I also represent Midtown East, El Barrio, and Roosevelt Island. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts and the New York Preservation Archive Project for inviting me to speak here today and for all the hard work that you do. It makes some of the hard work that I have to do a lot easier having you as advocates in the community. 50 years ago, New York City lost the Brokaw Mansion, one of its greatest landmarks. We lost the Brokaw Mansion because of an unresponsible overdevelopment, which is still a major threat to many of our historic sites. However, the loss of Brokaw Mansion, the original Penn Station, and the near destruction of Grand Central Terminal ignited grassroots preservation movement in our city. Fortunately, the loss of the Brokaw Mansion led directly to the creation of groups like Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts, which has protected innumerable landmarks in our city. Furthermore, it inspired the city government to take legislative actions to preserve our historic sites. This year, we also celebrate the 50th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks Law. Together, preservationist groups and the Landmarks Law have ensured that our city retains much of its historic character and beauty so that future generations of New Yorkers are aware of their city's past. While many of our historic sites all still face challenges, the situation has dramatically improved since the Brokaw Mansion was torn down 50 years ago. Even though we lost Brokaw Mansion, today we can look on at Fifth Avenue, dotted with beautiful Gilded Age mansions, which is something we all benefit from. As proof of this, we sit here right now in Sinclair House. Many of us have enjoyed visiting the Frick Collection in the former Frick House or the Jewish Museum in the Warburg House. These homes have been preserved for public use for many future generations. We owe the New York City Landmarks Law and preservationist groups like Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts a great deal of gratitude for saving our city's history. I just want to make one appeal. This is an ongoing fight. It started way before 50 years ago, and just because we are celebrating the 50th anniversary doesn't mean that things aren't just as important now. We saw the Landmarks Preservation Commission decalendar buildings all over our city in an attempt to do it to every single one, and we were able to fight that back, but it's still there. It's still the specter. It's still coming. We have to fight that. I sit on the Landmarks Committee of the City Council under a land use chair where we have openly argued about landmarks and preserving our neighborhoods. where I have been one of the sole advocates on that committee in favor of preservation, as he advocates for depreservation and asking the Landmarks Commission on the record, could they please start de-landmarking as much of Manhattan as possible. These are the forces that we have to contend with, and I need your help. I can't do it alone. I need help from Friends of the Upper East Side Historics District. I need help from the New York Preservation Archive Project. I need help from all of you because on one side are the preservationists, people who believe in history, who believe in having ties to our past, in preserving light and air and communities. And on the other side is an infinite amount of money and greed that can only be stopped by people. So what you're doing here by participating today is so very important, and I just call upon you to please support these fine organizations and please support changes in our government to make sure that we can maintain some sense of history and preservation. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Franny Eberhardt, and I'm president of Friends of the Upper East Side, and I also welcome you here. We're delighted and very grateful to the Ukrainian Institute for taking us in. Friends and the Preservation Archive, New York Preservation Archive Project are co-hosting this evening. The Friends of the Upper East Side is an independent, not-for-profit membership organization dedicated to preserving the architectural legacy and livability and sense of place of the Upper East Side. And the Preservation Archive Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to documenting, preserving, and celebrating the history of preservation in New York City. I'd also like to recognize the New York Landmarks50 Alliance. That was mentioned before. That is the group that is organizing a broad celebration across the city of the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Law, involving all kinds of cultural organizations like this and others. It's a remarkable job and a real celebration of something that's very important to our past, present, and future. Tonight's program will be convened and moderated by Tony Wood, head of the New York Preservation Archive Project, a former Friends of the Upper East Side president also. I think he probably needs no introduction, and so I'll turn the podium over to Tony.
Well, there's no better way to warm you up and get your blood boiling on a cold night than to contemplate the buildings we lost before we had the Landmarks Law. So get ready for a hot evening. Many people still believe that our Landmarks Law was the singular result of the demolition of the great Pennsylvania station. And the version of preservation's history that some people still have goes like this. Phoenix-like, out of the rubble of Penn Station, emerged the Landmarks Law, a great civic morality tale. New York, having suffered the tragic loss of Penn Station, learned its lesson, created a law to make sure that loss would never happen again. It's a very compelling creation myth. But the problem is, it's a myth. The true story of New York's Landmarks Law does not begin and end with Pennsylvania Station, despite the leading role it played in that drama. It's important to correct the Penn Station myth because it robs preservation of 50 years of rich history. It also denies the important role played by buildings like the one we celebrate tonight, the Brokaw Mansion, which a number of years ago we would have seen right through those windows. To understand the role the Brokaw Mansion played in the exciting story of how we got our Landmarks Law, we first have to set the stage. Though the origins of the Landmarks Law go back at least to 1913, the way I look at it, for our purposes tonight, and in order to get us home at a decent hour and before the next snowstorm, we're going to pick up that story at the midpoint in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. The post-war period in New York City was one of great change. Midtown Manhattan was coming under pressure from the development of new office buildings. Some New Yorkers were shocked by the announcement that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at Madison and 46th Street was to be demolished. It was less than 40 years old. Another pending demolition that greatly troubled some New Yorkers was that of St. Nicholas Church at 5th Avenue and 48th Street. Additionally, the city was beginning to experience the excesses of an increasingly high-handed Robert Moses. His efforts to bring the city into the age of the automobile antagonized concerned New Yorkers across the city. Here we see villagers celebrating a victory in their battle to save Washington Square Park from a Moses road. Also on the post-war agenda was slum clearance, a policy that threatened slums like this, Colonnade Row, Willow Place in Brooklyn. Further pressure was being put on Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village by the building of new apartment buildings and institutional expansions. Perhaps the greatest threat of all was the spirit of the times, the love of the new for the sake of the new, the contemporary, the fresh. As Time magazine wrote, "Nothing makes a New Yorker happier than the sight of an old building rich in memories of the past, unless it's tearing the damn thing down and replacing it with something in chromium and plate glass with no tradition at all." Some passionate New Yorkers, however, were not happy with this state of affairs. And in 1950, the then president of the Municipal Art Society, Francis Keeley, announced there ought to be a law to protect what was being lost. 4 essential ingredients were needed to be in place in order to have such a law. First, one had to know what it was you wanted to save. And the Municipal Art Society and the Society of Architectural Historians took on this challenge and meticulously and methodically developed a list, the Index of Architecturally Historic Buildings in New York City. The list first appeared in 1951, was refined over the years, and published in 1957. Next, one had to build a constituency that wanted to protect the sites you'd identified. That index provided the intellectual capital for all sorts of educational efforts that unfolded in the 50s. Exhibits, walking tours. You know, there was once a time in New York where there weren't walking tours. Can you believe that? That it was actually such a phenomenal invention that it caught the attention of the New Yorker to write about the first walking tour in New York. But this list led to walking tours, exhibits, tours, and a plaque program acknowledging the importance of buildings. The third thing that was needed was a legal basis for the regulation of private property on aesthetic grounds. Albert Sprague Bard first floated such an idea back in 1913. For over 40 years, he never gave up on it, trying a myriad ways to advance that concept. Bard was like a dog with a bone. Finally, in 1956 in Albany, that permission was obtained with the passage of the Bard Act, the New York State authorizing legislation that gave municipalities in the state the authority, if they chose to use it, to pass a local landmarks law. It took Bard over 40 years to achieve for cities the right to regulate private property on aesthetic grounds. This is what you look like after 40 years trying to save preservation. This was when Bard was 90. Bard is an unsung preservation hero, and he's been that way for decades. One of the nice things about the 50th anniversary is his importance is finally getting to be a little more widely known. So remembering that this is the 50th anniversary of the law, meaning that it passed in 1965, so what happened between 1956, when we had the authority for a landmarks law, and 1965, when the city actually decided to use it? What happened? Still missing was the last ingredient needed for a law, the political will to enact one. And that's where the Brokaw Mansion plays a critically important role in helping create that political will. Actually, it helped twice. The landmarks law is truly an example of the old saying, if the people lead, leaders will follow. With the passage of the Bard Act, citizens saw in it the possibility of legal protection for their neighborhoods. Here, Mayor Wagner is being urged to implement the Bard Act to save Greenwich Village. In April of 1959, over 400 people, 2 of which I think are here tonight at least, attended a meeting in Brooklyn Heights. On its agenda was how the Bard Act could be used to save Brooklyn Heights. And Brooklyn preservation activists quickly realized the potential of the Bard Act to protect their neighborhood. Since the 1940s, Greenwich Village had been looking for legal ways to protect the village. And in 1959, Save the Village launched a petition drive seeking 10,000 signatures calling for citywide measures to protect New York's cherished neighborhoods. They basically were calling for the implementation of the Bard Act. Who was the first signer of the petition? Albert Bard. Despite these cries from Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village, and citywide civic organizations who are also involved. The village just always does the PR. The city didn't move forward with the BART Act. So why wasn't the BART Act immediately implemented in New York? The reason in part was James Felt. In 1956, Felt had been appointed as the new chair of the City Planning Commission. Shortly thereafter, he announced he would undertake the Herculean task of trying to create and pass a new zoning resolution which New York desperately needed. It was initially thought that this new zoning revision would be the vehicle that would use the BART Act to put historic zoning into the city to protect buildings. However, instead, the new zoning turned out to be an obstacle. Felt, seen in the middle of this slide, realized that getting his new zoning approved was going to be a heavy enough political lift without including historic preservation within it. And he finally told the preservation advocates, who are pushing him from all sides, that if they would just shut up and go away, he would try and take on preservation after he had achieved his new zoning. The new zoning was approved without historic zoning in it in December of 1960. In the spring of 1961, Felt was true to his word. Working closely with Jeffrey Platt, seen here, and Harmon Goldstone of the Municipal Art Society, Felt became the rabbi for the preservation law, helping advance it within the Wagner administration. And in June of 1961, Mayor Wagner appointed a mayoral commission, headed by Platt, to study the question of preservation. And in December, it issued a report calling for the creation of a Landmarks Commission. And on April 21st, 1962, the Mayor's Advisory Landmarks Preservation Commission was appointed. But it had no legal authority to protect a thing. But it was tasked with two important challenges: identifying sites and drafting a law. At the same time, the drama over Pennsylvania Station was beginning to boil over. It was on August 2nd, 1962, that the now famous picketing of Penn Station took place. Organized by AGBANY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, a group of young architects, civic activists, and concerned New Yorkers marched in front of Pennsylvania Station to protest its pending demolition. And we have one of those marchers who will be joining us on stage later. In October of 1963, demolition would begin on Penn Station. While the very public demolition of Penn Station continued, the roster of other threatened buildings continued to grow. In August 1964, it was announced that McKim, Mead & White's Savoy Plaza was going to be demolished. An August 1964 Municipal Art Society newsletter featured a list compiled by Henry Hope Reed of threatened buildings in New York. On it were the Custom House, the Singer Building, the New York Stock Exchange, the 7th Regiment Armory, Friends Meeting House, the Metropolitan Opera House, and the Percy Pine Residence. That was where things stood when the crisis over the Brokaw Mansion broke in the fall of 1964. At that time, the mansion was already well known. It had been identified in that early list that the Municipal Art Society and the Society of Architectural Historians had put together. It appeared in Alan Burnham's 1963 book, New York Landmarks. Now, actually, there were 4 mansions. The most prominent, and the one at the center of attention, was 1 East 79th Street, a partial replica of a 16th century chateau in the Loire Valley. The mansion was begun in 1887 and built for the manufacturer Isaac Brokaw. Adjoining it to the north were 2 twin flamboyant Gothic houses built for his sons and modeled after the late 15th century Palace of Justice in Rouen. The 4th house was 5, often sometimes called 7, East 79th Street, a more chaste mansion that was built for the daughter. In 1960, the New York Community Trust put one of its historic plaques on the building, then owned by the Institute of Radio Engineers. The building had already been designated by the Commission as worthy of saving, but remember, that was only honorific at that time. So on September 17, 1964, the plans to demolish the Brokaw Mansion were made public in the New York Times. Immediately, the Municipal Art Society sent telegrams to the mayor urging something be done. The next day, the New York Times editorial headlined "The Disappearing Landmarks" read, "The question now seems to be, will there be any historic landmarks left in New York City by the time a proposed law to save them sees the light of day? Hardly a week passes when doom is not pronounced for an admirable old building. The latest mark for replacement is the fabulous Brokaw Mansion." So in the narrative of how New York got its law, it's critical to note the important role of the New York Times and Ada Louise Huxtable. Between December of 1961 and the passage of the law in 65, the New York Times ran over 20 pro-preservation editorials. Most, if not all, were written by Ada Louise. That's not counting the visibility she gave the cause through her own columns. Well, the announcement of the planned demolition of the mansion was particularly embarrassing because it coincided with what would have been a rather innocuous mayoral announcement that New York was going to participate in American Preservation Week, running from September 28th to October 4th of 1964. As the New York Times editorialized, while Mayor Wagner sits on this proposal and old buildings go down like dominoes, he announces he'll issue a proclamation. The result of all this was that the draft landmarks law, which had been languishing on the mayor's desk since May, was finally made public. Now, New Yorkers have been rallying for preservation for years, hundreds at events in Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village. However, it's a very different thing when street demonstrations start happening on the streets of the Upper East Side. And indeed, they did over the Brokaw Mansion, seen here on September 26, 1964. As a counter-event to this declared Landmark Preservation Week, on October 2nd, there was a funeral march that was scheduled by students to protest the razing of the Savoy Plaza, the threat to the Pine-Davidson block, and the Brokaw Mansion. Sadly, that was canceled by rain. However, the mounting pressure did begin to shake things loose, and on October 6, 1964, the long-awaited landmarks law, which had been on the mayor's desk, was finally introduced into the city council, sponsored by 3 council members. December of that year witnessed another preservation cliffhanger, the threat to the Pine-Davidson block on Park Avenue between 68th and 69th Streets. The December 22nd New York Times editorial, The Crumbling Landmarks, noting the scaffold going around the buildings, wrote, "The latest word on the landmarks front is that there are about to be a few less of them, as usual. This is not the first restrictive legislation that New York has found necessary for the purpose of controlling exploitation of the city's land and construction. The zoning law is a prime example. There would be no light, air, or order without it. Without the landmarks law, there will be no color, character, or history." Fortunately for New York City, there would be a New Year's miracle. Early in January, an anonymous donor, later identified as the Marchesa de Cuevas, bought the buildings as demolition was literally underway. In its January 1965 editorial, Miracle on 68th Street, the New York Times said it all, both praising the saving but lamenting the state of affairs. The Times wrote, "Miracles and magnanimity are fine, but they are not the legislative answer to preservation. That lies in the hands of the city council now." As the new year progressed, the threat looming over the Brokaw Mansion became greater. There was a last-minute scramble to save the mansion. The city considered buying it for a museum. There was talk of it becoming the headquarters for the new CUNY University of New York, or it might become a guest house for visiting dignitaries. The Taconic Foundation was listed as a prospective buyer, as well as a Greek religious institution. The mansion was finally vacated on April 1st, or it was to be vacated on April 1st, but the schedule was moved up. The builders of the planned apartment building were well aware of the last-minute flurry of interest trying to save the building. And as Anthony Campagna Sr. of the construction company later revealed, "We got in there a little early. A friend tipped us off. It was common sense, self-defense. With all the adverse publicity, every day counts," he explained. Jeffrey Platt remembered, "The mayor's office tried to do something about that. One of the secretaries called me, and they said, 'We can hold things up until Monday if you can think of what to do.' But no one could think of anything to do. There was no mechanism. The mechanism wasn't there." So that had a big effect. Well, then it finally happened. On Saturday, February 6, 1965, demolition began. The horror of the event was captured in a February 8th New York Times editorial entitled "Rape of the Brokaw Mansion." Those are strong words for the New York Times in 1965. It read, "In weekend stealth, the vulture-like work of destroying another New York City landmark has begun. The despoilers were so eager to get this lovely building down that they were delighted to pay premium rates to the workmen for their weekend toll. 'We ain't breaking no laws,' said an anonymous spokesman for the anonymous wreckers. 'There are no laws to break. And at the rate the city is moving on passage of its pending landmarks law, There will be no landmarks to save, just new monuments to ugliness. Boy, if the Times wrote editorials like that today. The importance of the Brokaw Mansion to the passage of the law was noted in Nathan Silver's Lost New York, published in 1967, when he wrote, "The outcry was undoubtedly what at last induced the mayor to sign the law giving the Landmarks Commission legal powers. And that fact is the most distinguished landmark quality the Brokaw Mansion ever had." Well, despite that little backhanded compliment, it's clear that the Brokaw crisis was what it took to give the politicians, both the city council and the mayor, the political will they needed to take action. And indeed, on April 6, 1965, the city council passed the landmarks law, 33 of its 35 members supporting it and 2 abstaining. And on April 19, 1965, Mayor Wagner signed the landmarks bill into law. Even after the demolition, the loss of the mansion was used to further prod the administration. A New York Times editorial titled "Still the Wrecker's Ball" noted, "At the corner of 79th Street and 5th Avenue, a small rose of Sharon tree is budding, half buried in dusty stone rubble. Old boards lean brutally against its branches. It is all that is left to mark the site of the Brokaw Mansion." The editorial goes on lamenting that despite even the passage of the law, no official designations of buildings and areas can be protected can be made until there's a permanent landmarks commission that's appointed. And indeed, the good news is the permanent commission was appointed, and so began its 50 years of operation. The law was too late to protect the Brokaw Mansion, so today we have this. The threat to the Brokaw Mansion and its ultimate demolition, both events, helped provide that final push needed to create the political will to make the landmarks law a reality. And it's important to keep alive the painful memory of loss of the Brokaw Mansion to make sure that preservation in New York is not taken for granted. Knowing our preservation history is essential to maintaining that political will to protect the landmarks law from those who would still prefer that it not exist. And as we heard from our council member, it's still under threat today, 50 years later. But anyway, long live the Brokaw Mansion in our civic consciousness. Thank you. Now, to give you a little more intimate feel of what was lost, if your blood isn't boiling yet, we're going to show 2 brief film clips of the mansion. Well, one is going to be the first one, and they run together, is from a film made in 1962. It was a CBS program directed by Gordon Hyatt called La Vie Elegante. And that's then going to be followed by a home movie that was made by Thomas Bartlett, who was the chief accountant of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, which was the organization resulting from the merger of the Institute of Radio Engineers that had the building and the American Institute of Electrical Engineers when they came together. So he made this film in 1963, shortly after those 2 organizations were merged. So we're going to show those films, and then we're going to move to our panel. So if technology is cooperating, the film.
The year is 1962, but we're asking you to forget that fact and come back with us for a look at a way of life that has vanished. We're going to leave the age of steel and glass and jet planes behind us and take you on a tour of the magnificent mansions of Manhattan. The townhouses that you'll see, with glittering ballrooms, gala concert halls, and almost endless dinners, were the settings for the Gilded Age, when millionaires were arrogant and the social ladder disappeared into a swirling cloud of Astors and Vanderbilts, each attempting to outdo the other and having a spectacular time while they did. So, if you're ready, let's begin. Home, Findlay.
What's the point of the elegant life? It's the idea that an important man should live with ceremony in an important house. It's an idea that has existed ever since we lost our lease on the Garden of Eden. Or, to quote from a philosopher of the period, everything should be on a scale exactly proportionate to the gentleman's income. These were the times when the poor really had something to look up to, although perhaps less to look forward to. In 1889, Isaac Brokaw built this house, a copy of the 16th century Château de Chenonceau in France. Through this building and the twin houses built next door for his sons, it's possible to see how Isaac Brokaw envisioned a monument to his success, an estate for future generations. The doors are massive bronze that call for a hearty butler and suggest all the solid turn-of-the-century imperialism of the 1900s. This table weighs 1.5 tons. The entrance hall is carved from fitted blocks of sandstone. George Brokaw saw when styles were changing, and he engaged in a legal battle to break his father's will and have the houses replaced by an apartment. But the family opposed him, and the houses stand today. Up to this point, we've been showing you the evolution, the growth, and the styles of the great houses of the Gilded Age in brilliant sunlight. But imagine now that the sun has set into the red haze of New Jersey, and Manhattan is twilight, twinkling with candles, with champagne and diamonds. What was it like for the very rich when the owner of a stately mansion stepped out for the evening? Precise timing was one key factor. It took an army of servants to maintain a great house, and this army, preparing a vast entertainment, had to expect the guests to be on time, especially when the guest list totaled 50 or 100 or 400. By touching a concealed latch, we reveal a dining room secret. This is where Isaac Brokaw locked up the gold and silver service that was required for the impressive ritual called the formal dinner. Now, a dinner is serious business, so we quote the words of Ward McAllister, the social arbiter of the age, to give us the ground rules.
In going into dinner, there is but one rule to be observed. The lady of the house, in almost every case, goes in last, all her guests preceding her, with this exception, that if the President of the United States dines with you, or royalty, he takes in the lady of the house, preceding all of the guests.
Tonight, the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, is not with us, so we may proceed. This dining room has been converted into the boardroom of the Institute of Radio Engineers, who have adapted many outstanding features of the Brokaw houses. With the help of the jewelers, Black Star and Frost, we may say, however, that dinner is served.
feel even worse about what we lost. We're now going to move to the next part of our evening, which is really a chance to talk to people who witnessed and participate in history, who are getting mic'd up at the moment. So joining us are really people who just have great personal stories to tell us. So first is John Cahalan, who is the CEO of Concern Worldwide US, the affiliate of a group called Concern Worldwide, which is a wonderful and very important group that he speaks for a lot. But tonight is probably one of the few times in his life where he is flying under a very different flag. And he's tonight wearing his hat as the son of the living caretaker and superintendent of the Brokaw Mansion, who actually grew up in the building. So that will lead us to some good stories. Joining him, and with a different perspective on the house, is Peter Samton. And many of you know Peter. He was one of the young Turk architects at the time of AGBANY, the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, that had picketed in front of Penn Station and had remained active at that time in the whole kind of landmark things that were going on. And so we're lucky to have them with us tonight. And I've asked them each to just begin with just to tell us initially their relationship to the house, to the houses, and just some of their memories. And then I'm going to follow up with prodding questions before we open it up to the audience. So I don't know. Why don't we get the real insider view of somebody who grew up in those houses?
John, I keep renaming. I was going to correct you twice. That's one. The other is that Tony has written a book, of course, about this and told us about the myth that Pennsylvania Station was the catalyst for the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And he did a very good job of putting the Brokaw Mansion in its proper place. But in my family, we busted the myth that Penn Station had anything to do with it. We've always had 10 years in power of the Brokaw Mansion. I should tell you, my wife Carolyn is here, and she always tells me that when I'm asked where I grew up, I finally arrive at this statement: 79th Street and 5th Avenue, but here's the but. I have to explain myself when I tell people. It usually goes like, where did you grow up? Oh, Manhattan. Where? Upper East Side. Oh, where? 79th Street. 79th and where? 79th and 5th, but. Here's the but. My parents were Irish immigrants, came to America separately, not knowing one another, just before the Great Depression, a year or two before the Depression. My father, who I later found out was a closet illiterate that I taught to read when I was 16 in the mansion, separate story. I got a job as a landscaper in Dorchester, New York. And the rows of Sharon trees that the Times mentioned were planted by my father. They're a very Irish tree, shrub. And I remember the day he got permission to plant the trees in the garden around the Brokaw Mansion. So my father was a landscaper in Dorchester, New York. My mother got a job as a live-in maid for a family named Pell, William Pell, who was executive vice president for a bank whose name I can never remember, but it had New York in it. I don't know if it was New York Bankers Trust or Bank of New York, but I believe it held the mortgage of George Brokaw on the mansion, this bank. And when my mother announced that she was engaged, the Pell family living in Rye, New York, were extraordinarily generous and caring to my mother. They wanted to meet my father. So my father came over for dinner. That turned into my father being brought to the bank. How they discovered that he couldn't read or write is a mystery of the family. Or maybe he confided in Mr. Pell. But he got a job as a greeter at the bank. He was a doorman without uniform. He would open the door and chat with people. My father had this marvelous characteristic of, I describe it as treating janitors and judges alike. And I could imagine that he was very friendly to George Brokaw as he was to other customers of the bank. And one day, now here the history is a little vague, but one One theory is that the bank was demanding that George Brokaw have a caretaker live in the building because they held the mortgage. The other is that this was George Brokaw's idea on his own. He propositioned my father with, would he said he already discussed it with the bank, my father could do his job, but would he move in? And so my father, not being a fool, vacated the Catalyzing Mansion in the Bronx and moved into the Brokaw Mansion on 79th Street in Fifth Avenue. Fast forward, the Institute of Radio Engineers bought the building, and George Brokaw put in the deed of sale, and my parents were kept on as the superintendent when they moved in. And so for the better part of 30 years, we lived in the Brokaw Mansion. That's the story of why. That's the why.
Terrific. Peter, tell us your relationship to the Brokaw Mansion.
Well, we've told about the inside of the Brokaw. Most of us never got a chance to see the inside. We were young architects and very interested in the outside. But the situation of the Brokaw Mansion was somewhat different than Penn Station. Penn Station, as Tony mentioned, the picket line at Penn Station occurred 2 years, a little over 2 years earlier, in 1962. And that was the first of any of these picket lines, I think, that ultimately there were several others, but it was the first time architects ever assembled to do something like that. And there were many picket lines in those days, but they were usually people in industry and labor and so forth. But for young architects to get out in front of the public and demonstrate was unusual. And at Penn Station, we contrived that we need to do this in a very different way, and we had hand-lettered signs, and we all dressed up. Every male had to wear a suit and tie, because we somehow wanted to stand out as being different. And we did it, but we didn't succeed. By the time the Brokaw Mansion picket line came, it was already fait accompli. The Penn Station was on its way to destruction. But there was still an active group that came there because while the building was considerably smaller, it was a gem. As Tony mentioned, it was a kind of a replica of the Chateau Chenonceau in the Loire Valley. And again, the same group of architects, different but some of the same people, many of them in their 20s, had been to Europe and had the chance to take the tour of Europe and see all the wonderful monuments and the cities. And when we came back here, we saw the opposite happening. We went abroad to educate ourselves and to learn about the architecture, the great buildings of the past there. And so we came here and we began to open our eyes, and other things were happening other than the Brokaw Mansion. There was many examples, as Tony mentioned earlier, of buildings that were in jeopardy. One of those was a totally different situation, which some of us were worried about too, and that was the demolition of the Savoy Plaza opposite the Plaza Hotel. And not that that was a building as great as the Plaza Hotel, but the plans already had been developed, and it was clear because the zoning then gave bonuses for plazas in those days, wherever you built a plaza, you get a bonus. And the idea of building a plaza in front of the plaza didn't make any sense. And so a lot of us, there was a demonstration to save the Savoy Plaza from, which was a lot line building and continued the wall along Fifth Avenue right down south of 57th Street. And we were more interested in the urban character of that area. We lost that battle, and as you know, Savoy Plaza was demolished and an office building took its place. Fortunately, the Apple store is there making it a little bit better. But the Brokaw Mansion was sort of a last-minute event. It was sort of a pickup game, if you will. A lot of us heard about it. I was not one of the organizers of that, although I was an organizer of the Penn Station picket. But I got calls from a couple of friends, and I took a handful of people from my office then, and we went up there, and this was late in 1964, I believe. But we realized, as we realized at Penn Station, that it was probably going to be futile, but we felt somehow we had to speak up. We couldn't just allow this to happen. And if we didn't care, who would care? And it didn't get the same press as Penn Station being a much bigger and well-known monument. But many of us felt good doing it, and that spirit continued until and even after the Landmarks Preservation Commission came into being the following year. It was interesting that I was then in my, I guess I was still in my 20s then, but the idea of being an architect and trying to do good architecture was a challenge enough. But then if you created an important building, just the notion that it might be torn down 30 years later seemed crazy, that we all worked so hard. And New York, more than any city, maybe with the exception of Boston and San Francisco possibly, had real major buildings that we wanted to see continue, and therefore, if we were bold enough to think that we would become great architects, and our buildings would be torn down just a few years later, it was a very personal thing. And at the same time, while it was not so much a career thing, many of us really believed in the city and believed that what we did and what great architects did made life better for everybody. And it was an emotional experience being on this the picket line of the Brokaw Mansion as it was at Penn Station. And after that, I think having a friend in court, mainly the Landmarks Preservation Commission, helped. And I think the failures that we had in saving the buildings did do something that proved that maybe what our picket lines had some value.
Can I ask you both, if you could take you in your memory, going back to the kind of that fall of 1964 and then early 65 when the demolition began, just, was this a topic of conversation? I mean, clearly among some friends and all, but I mean, what was the sense like in the city? I mean, was this and Joe, I'm not sure exactly where you were, if you were in the city at the time, but if both of you just kind of, if you can take your minds back to 64 that fall and then the demolition, just the reactions you heard, or if other people were talking about this. And
well, the 1960s was a terrible time for architecture in New York. That was a period when probably a dozen or more of these huge white brick setback buildings on the east side were in construction. And one or two on Fifth Avenue also. There was one that was built just north of the Gruzen Museum, a smaller one, but throughout the east side, these buildings were popping up, and it was just the difference between something like a Brokaw Mansion and then a 25-story white brick ziggurat that would suddenly find its place. Fortunately, it wasn't quite as bad as the building that replaced Brokaw, but it was bad enough, as you pointed out in our image. And we were, we were very concerned. We were worried that New York was really going downhill. And it took a while. The Landmarks Preservation Commission helped. It also helped that a number of good architects started to do prominent work in the city. I was working at the time at Marcel Breuer's office and working in the Whitney Museum. And so that was not too far away. And I would come up and go to the Whitney, and the Whitney was just about being built as the Brokaw Mansion was being torn down at that point in the 1960s. And so it was a crazy juxtaposition with the good on the one hand and the bad on the other. And the Brokaw Mansion represented the good and the best.
Joe, were you in New York? And
I was.
Your mic a little more.
Okay, I was, we were living in the mansion. I lived there till the very end. So actually we had moved to 587 Main Street, which was the daughter's room. We got somewhere along the line, I guess when the IEEE by that time bought that mansion, we got moved into a 3-bedroom apartment, and I remember crawling in a beautiful kitchen.
You guys kept moving up.
But so, of course, it was very personal to us, so we were following everything. I remember vividly my father running into the house one day. I didn't know Peter, obviously, but he was getting us out on the street because people were outside protesting, and now I protest, so it's great joy. But so no, I think we were very, very aware of it. And it always struck me, and I was thinking about it since I was asked to be here, but it always struck me that my parents were devastated because they were losing their home. But at least in equal measure, these, I didn't expect it, but these, humble, hardworking people were really upset about the fact that this magnificent mansion was coming down. It was about their personal interest, but it was much greater than that. And they could get that this was such an incredible loss, and it made no sense to me.
Did all three come? I mean, they took down the corner building first, but then did they proceed in short order to remove the other two of the three buildings that were coming?
Yes, I believe that the current footprint is on all 4 buildings.
Well, and actually, one of the building took 3 of the Brokaw buildings, but it only took one of the 2 twins that were built for the sons. And so one of those remained later.
Okay.
It was then torn down.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But I'm sure 5 East came down.
Okay, that's what I said.
At the same time.
Yeah.
In fact, the film of the woman on the spiral staircase, that's actually 5 East of the Main Street.
And I have wedding pictures of my sister. My sister's wedding. So the wedding went from St. Ignatius Loyola on 84th and Park to this. So you can imagine what this mansion meant to my family.
We're going to have to talk about other photos you might have. I'd like to give a chance for the audience for a question. I think we have a floating mic that will float to someone. It's just hard to see. I see two hands over there, so let's start with that side of the room.
I can yell. On the topic of architecture, just perversely, who is the architect of this thing across the street?
Well, we have a prominent architect historian in the audience, but I don't know if he knows the answer to that question, and I won't call him out unless he nods that he does. Andrew's not nodding, okay, so I won't call him out. Next question there.
Were any of the architectural details on the inside, such as balustrade, mantelpieces, stained glass, was any of that saved?
Well, I can tell you what my research shows, and then Joe may know from being there. There was a great hurry to get the buildings down for obvious reasons. And there are accounts in the press of people who wanted to buy some of the pieces for salvage. And they weren't sold. But then there were some other things on the internet that suggested a few items were actually saved. We actually tried to track one down, but you know, the dust of history. But there was no, like when the Piercy Pine, or the Pine Davidson block was about to be demolished, they actually were taking out the fireplace surrounds. They were actually beginning to remove the decorative flooring. So you know, they were actually trying to salvage things from that building. But I think Brokaw, there was this urgency to get it down.
That's exactly my recollection, is that everything came down. There were looters on weekends that would try to get in. There was security, but I think there was some looting, but the intention was just there.
There's also, there was an interesting phenomenon, excuse me, at that time. In the case of Penn Station, one of the crazy things that happened, a lot of people, when we picketed Penn Station and months and a year after that, people kept saying, what do you care about that dirty black building? Because it was black. It was literally, from 50 years of soot in the city, it was all black. But those of us who have been in Europe, and many of my brethren who picketed at that time had come back from a year studying in France or Italy. We were aware that in Europe they were beginning to clean the monuments. If you recall, in the early 60s, buildings that were black, the Louvre, or other buildings in London or Paris or Berlin, started to be green and white and pink, beautiful, much lighter. And we knew that when they started to demolish Penn Station, that it would reveal the beautiful pink stone that it was originally built of. And sure enough, when the hammer started to hit, and you could see the inside of it, you saw the wonderful color of the original Penn Station. You know, we kept saying all they had to do was clean it. And in the case of the Brokaw Mansion, it was also, it wasn't the same thing. It was different stone, and it wasn't as dark and as grimy. But the whole idea of cleaning a building and making it, bringing it to its origins a little more was, we just didn't have that habit in this country. We were not used to seeing a building age. The early 60s was a period of Dixie Cup architecture, we called it, where you bring the Dixie Cup and you throw it away, or you go into a building and you use it and you throw it away. And that was the mindset.
Yeah, and then that's, when I was making that point earlier, that in a sense that was one of the largest obstacles, was that the preservation ethic that I think exists today with many people was hardly present. So absolutely. In the back, and is our floating mic? Yes.
I can chat as well. Peter, then as now, the real estate industry is very powerful, and today as then, not a lot of architects would be willing to put themselves forward to speak out. But you didn't see any retaliation, perhaps from the real estate industry or any lack of...
Did you lose any jobs because you took such a hopeful position?
Well, I was too young. I was, was basically at the bottom of the ladder at that point. But you had people like, I mean, the interesting thing is that Charles Lockman, who was the architect to replace Penn Station with the Madison Square Garden, before that, he was the president of Lever Brothers. And the thing that irritated me the most was that here he was, the client for the Lever House, which was done by SOM, and then he left and started a practice as architecture, and of all things, did a building to replace Penn Station. But, I mean, it was, that doesn't so much relate to what I'm saying, but it was a very weird time, that a person of such stature, being president of Lever Brothers, becomes an architect with a successful practice, but did an awful thing. I mean, I wrote him a letter, a very nasty letter, and he wrote me back. We were doing things that, I don't know, we were speaking up, but it was quite futile.
There was a hand here, and then we're over here. The lady at the mic.
My question is mainly more of what's happening today, because I live in the Upper West Side, and now we have two huge towers that's just destroying the view. 57th Street, where are the people who are, talking about these things that are destroying what New York is like right now? Buildings are being torn down all the time, and some of them are quite beautiful. To put 110-story, where everything else is 40 stories. And now we've got these two monstrosity facing.
Well, I think what you're referring to is particularly egregious. I don't think there's anything wrong with tall buildings. New York City, probably more than any city in the world, has witnessed tall buildings that have, in some way, have contributed to the city at certain times. But as you point out, building huge 100-story buildings on 57th Street, when they cast shadows on Central Park, is a different matter. I think where you put the building is more critical than how tall it is, and where its shadow goes. Many of you remember that when they were planning to build a building at the corner of 59th Street and the Columbus Circle project, we all had umbrellas, and we made as if we were showing the shadow of the proposed building then, which was to be very tall, and it was then designed by Moshe Safdie, very good architect, but it was much too tall and created we simulated a shadow. This was Municipal Art Society did this by having these umbrellas go way deep into the park. The current block of buildings that is planned for 52nd Street, my estimation is that many of them will cast shadows all the way up to 72nd Street, especially this time of year.
The question you raised is the subject, it should be the subject of many other panels. But frankly, I think all of us have to take that to heart. I mean, the city is at risk in a different way today, but just as risky as it was back when Brokaw was there. There was anything here?
Wonderful program. Thank you. My question kind of touched on when you said we're egregious, because the thing I've been hearing tonight is what we lost and what replaced what we lost. And we talk about the landmark preservation. It seems like if the concern is that the building is not as good as what it's taking away, is that the same issue as, let's say, you took the Masaru building that you worked on? If, let's say, I had replaced Brokaw with what's there now, which is a great piece of architecture, would the Brokaw Mansion's destruction be as egregious? And so when we talk about preservation, I'm concerned that if we always couple it with, well, look what replaced it, you're losing the argument that it doesn't matter what replaces it. The integrity is the building that's there now. And I'd just like to see if the panel would like to comment on that.
Well, I would totally agree with that. That's a gem. And just because it's replaced by something better, even if it were, in this case it clearly wasn't, I think these need to be preserved unto themselves. I mean, we don't have that many in Manhattan or in the city, and so I would very strongly say that should stand alone. It doesn't have to be coupled with it.
It shouldn't be an either or proposition, and despite what the real estate board in New York might tell you, I mean, with less than 4% of New York City protected for landmarks, that leaves an awful lot of the city left for wonderful new architecture. So it doesn't have to be built on top of landmarks. But clearly, historically, part of the reaction at the time was against a certain type of architecture. I mean, the irony is today is that with new awareness and appreciation, people are on the street picketing to save modernist buildings that when they were built, freaked out some preservationists.
My question is about the largest landmark building that was destroyed, namely the Singer Building. Now, one of the reasons why that was destroyed in 1968 was that the city did not want to support it, did not want to maintain it. So, can you talk about how that happened and why that happened?
Yes, but if the panel has some comments and
well, I think the main reason was it was a very small footprint, I think, of that building. I mean, it was just not economic to maintain it, or those that decided to tear it down. And I think that has something to do also, certainly in the 60s, when they were building many of the office buildings on 6th Avenue and Park Avenue and so forth. They were building big buildings that served larger corporations. And the Singer Building's footprint, I forgot what it was, but it's very small.
I mean, in a sense here, the point you're making is also that we have a landmarks law.
Yeah.
And yet we lost a building that many people, even before there was a law, were referencing as something that they hoped the law would save.
Right.
So I think you have to understand that the historical context, when the landmarks law was signed, despite kind of the great, in a sense, happiness brought to the preservation world, it didn't unleash a rampant series of designations.
Right.
Because this was, you have to understand, an unproven agency, an untested law, and certainly its first two chairmen, rightly or wrongly, we can judge, their top priority was making sure that they preserved the landmarks law itself. It was not a sure thing. When the law was signed by Wagner, at the same press conference, standing next to the head of the city council or the chair of the committee who took the law through, basically made the comment, if this law creates too many problems for the real estate industry, we will amend it. So one has to understand that it was a very challenging time for the commission.
I would add to that politically at that time, the chairman of the City Planning Commission was James Felt, under Wagner in the late 50s and early 60s. His brother was Irving Mitchell-Felt, who was the president of Pennsylvania Railroad, I think it was. So he was in charge. He was the ogre that we were fighting with when we were trying to save Penn Station. So you had, his brother is at the City Planning Commission. He's the guy responsible for tearing down Penn Station.
If you find that intriguing, a little self-promotion, there's a certain book on the history of the landmarks law that actually delves into that interesting relationship, because the landmarks law was always a few steps behind the demolition of Pennsylvania Station. And it's a very interesting historical question. And someday, hopefully, we'll find more papers you can find. I see one last hand, and then we're going to try and, I think, bring it to a close.
There's not a strong enough landmark presence in this city. Our last mayor, the reason we had those buildings on West 57th Street, Bloomberg said he wished all the oligarchs from Russia would buy in New York City. That's as egregious as what happened you gentlemen are talking about 50 years ago. They haven't, the structure of real estate and politics has not learned its lesson. They just moved their fleet to a different area.
Well,
now cannibalizing Central or South.
Can't agree with you more. I think that's kind of an interesting maybe symmetry to pull things together to end tonight, is that it was very telling that our city council member was urging us to support him in defending the landmarks law. And when you think back to the demolition, the protests in front of Brokaw Mansion, you had Ed Kotz there as a young politician and others talking in support of preservation. So the politics of preservation and the need for citizen action, the landmarks law was not a top-down mandate. The landmarks law was the people's law. I mean, the people of New York fought for that law for decades. And I think Wagner ultimately only signed it because it looked like he was out of control of his own city. I mean, with the buildings coming down with Brokaw. So in a sense, it's the political will that I talked about is still essential today for preservation. And it's not an easy time, and there are many advocates in this room who will happily speak to that during the reception. So on that note, I think we should bring this to a close. Thank everyone. I particularly need to thank Matthew Pudi, who's the Executive Director of the Archive Project, who helped pull together all the visuals and the technology tonight. So thank you. Thank you very much for your time.